Hi, I'm Michael, and this series presents a deep dive into a secret that I've been keeping for most of my life, but one that should never have been kept at all. It's my hope that learning my secret and the insights it has given me will help you understand either your own secrets or those of at least one person near to you. These audio episodes were originally recorded and released as a single 7.5 hour long video on YouTube. That video was really just me talking to the camera, so other than a few title cards, one thumbnail, and some body language for context, you're not really missing anything by listening rather than watching. Either way, you'll hear my message. That said, I only got asked to make an audio version after the original video was completed and released, so please understand that this introduction, my spoken trigger warnings, and the episode structure and breaks have all been hacked and hammered in after the fact, and please also excuse the few references to this video and the thumbnail. I don't think there will be anything too confusing in audio form, but if there is, a link to the original video is in the show notes. Also in the show notes will be links to any references and resources I mentioned in this episode. There are 8 episodes in total. Please only listen to them in order, as that order has been very carefully and very painfully chosen. This is episode 2 out of 8, Finding Common Ground. It introduces the language and vocabulary needed for the rest of the series, and later episodes will use that language heavily. It also introduces and discusses the notion of trauma, post-traumatic stress as a response to traumatic events, and the very serious mental health issues that can follow from these going untreated. So, hi, again, I'm Michael, and I have a secret. A very real secret, but not a good or a pleasant one. It's why I've packed on and carried around so much weight, and it's also what let me lose that weight, not just once, but many times. And it is why I've been able to keep it off this time, even in the middle of incredible hunger and every possible reason not to. If it doesn't quite literally kill me, it's the secret that might let me keep that weight off till my dying day. It's a secret that began to be kept very early in my life, and keeping that secret manifested in literally trapping and hiding it inside a cage of fat and flesh. It's a secret for a reason, but that reason has never been, not once, for my benefit or my comfort or my safety. It's a secret the world wants me to keep so it can feel safe at night. I have a secret that lets me do to myself what you only think you want to be able to do to yourself, but you can't. And that's why you ask me my secret when you really don't want to know it at all. And I wouldn't be telling you about it now if I didn't know that some of you need to hear about it anyway, even if you don't know that yet. That said, I need to give you a chance here to choose to filter yourself out. By now you're very clear. This video isn't about narrowboats or life on the canals, and you've also learned everything you're going to from me on the subject of weight loss. From here on out, all I'll be talking about is my secret. Doing that will involve detailing my own lifelong, quite serious mental health issues, including brief but potentially upsetting descriptions of both their symptoms and the objectively unpleasant experiences that spawned them. While I'm going to avoid the more graphic details, this will be considerably more detailed than anything I've ever mentioned in prior videos. So this is your opportunity to select out and go watch another video on either our channel or on YouTube, of which there are many. There's nothing wrong with doing so. What I'm going to discuss is for me extremely uncomfortable, and I've also seen for most of my life that others can find it much more uncomfortable than I do. That's why it's a secret. So I completely understand and support your deciding to step away now if you need to. Along the way, I'll also have to discuss how the religion and faith of others have affected these issues. And so if you'd rather not see the world through a hard atheist point of view, then without irony, go with my blessing. Similarly, while I don't intend to say anything particularly or overtly political, moral absolutists may find what I've got to say on the subjects of responsibility and forgiveness relatively infuriating. Either religion or absolutism or both might work for you, and for you, I'm genuinely glad they do. But if you're going to continue, you'll have to accept that for me, neither of them work, and neither of them ever could have worked. Finally, if a particular economic agenda has gotten you so well trained that the term trigger warning makes you foam at the mouth, you're going to want to skip at least the next few seconds. For those that have chosen to continue, and especially for those who might share some of my mental health issues, I'm going to put up a trigger warning title card where and when I know one is necessary. These will provide a moment to pause and prepare before anything too specific or unsettling is said. I can only really identify those things I know trigger me or have triggered others before, so I hope I don't miss anything for you along the way. I am going to be discussing issues of significant interpersonal violence causing significant psychological trauma at a very young age, as well as the shorter and longer term mental health issues that followed on from those experiences. That's going to require first some pretty general discussion of trauma and its effects, both mental and physical, followed by a more detailed discussion of the specific types of traumatic event and the specific effects and outcomes that form my personal experience and the basis for how and why I can speak on this subject at all. That will require some personal examples from my life history and the stories surrounding them, and while, as I said, I'm going to avoid the more graphic details, there will definitely be upsetting words and phrases, and the descriptions I give of both the events and the way I experienced them and the symptoms that resulted will certainly be capable of causing substantial triggering. I am sorry for taking so long to get here, and I'm just as sorry for the length of what remains. I have struggled for years to figure out how to present this, and I have literally been beating myself up for the last 9 months trying to record and re-record this video. For my own safety, this has to be my last attempt. So if you've made it this far, thank you for the investment and the trust. Listening to what follows with an actually open mind and heart actually remaining open to what I'm kind of literally dying to communicate is vastly harder than writing it. The paradigm shifts are behind me, but they're in front of you. You cannot yet know or yet understand how unfathomably deeply I appreciate the weight of effort required to hear me out. But from those depths, thank you. Now that we're past that checkpoint, I'm left with the problem that there is a certain amount of knowledge that simply isn't common, but that needs to be shared before I can proceed. So I need to introduce and define some terms and acronyms that probably aren't familiar to just anyone who happens across this video on YouTube. A cognitive bias is very broadly any tendency of human minds to make a particular choice or follow a particular path or program. We all have them, many of them. In fact, we depend on them to survive both individually and collectively. Some of them are hardwired into the physical machinery of our brains, while others have become part of the foundation and fabric of all our very different cultures. They can be both helpful and harmful. But pointing out that someone has a particular bias isn't a judgment of either them or that bias. It's just an opportunity to see that their thinking might have a tendency to lean in a direction that they might not actually want to move in if they thought about their thinking. One of these, in particular, plays a big part in how all of us think about all the very human subjects that orbit around my secret. Confirmation bias is something every human being both has and suffers from. It's the tendency of our brains to prefer information that supports and confirms what we already believe over any information that contradicts or challenges or expands what we already believe. You can think of it like the inertia of your learning and the thing holding you back from learning more. If you already believe the world is flat, you'll prefer information that appears to support that belief over information that it's actually round. Well, if you already believe that the world is actually round, you will prefer nice round globes and longitudes and latitudes measured in nice even degrees to ever discovering the term oblate spheroid and learning that your planet has never, not once, been the same shape twice. A thought-terminating cliché is a phrase or aphorism that is used to stop an argument, end the debate, or otherwise stop someone from speaking about an uncomfortable subject. They're a tool built into all of our natural languages for supporting our also natural confirmation bias. They're usually uttered to protect the person saying them from having to confront their own discomfort with contradictions in their own thinking about the subject matter. The cliché allows them to terminate further thought on the subject so they can walk away with their pre-existing ideas unchallenged. Thought-terminating clichés are really common. They're easy to deploy, easy to remember, and never actually either wise or insightful. Common examples include, we'll just have to agree to disagree, and everyone is entitled to their opinion. Neither of which has ever been said by anyone who could actually defend that opinion. When people who have never been fat ask someone who is fat, "Where's your self-control?" that's a thought-terminating cliché. Ironically, one they tend to say because they can't control themselves. Unfortunately, in my experience, when men speak about emotional subjects, especially online, a lot of other men, very often the older men, automatically reach for these easy clichés, so I've got to dispose of just a few of them here. If you tell someone to just stop thinking about it, you're assuming that the thinking isn't being done for a valid and essential and meaningful reason. Similarly, stop overthinking assumes that you're either the just right thinker or at least not the underthinker, while you've also basically admitted the person you're accusing of overthinking is the only one in the position to judge. Along the same lines, "you're too smart for your own good" implies that the dumber can do better, which is what lawyers call facts not in evidence, but also assumes that it's their good the smarter person is thinking of. It might well be your good, or our good, and not their own at all. When you advise someone to just get over it or just let it go, you're implying first that they haven't thought of that incredibly novel idea. Second, that it could ever be effective in the first place. And third, that you think that you could follow that advice if you were in their shoes. None of these has ever been remotely true. Similarly, there are phrases that are just outright nonsense. "Spare the rod, spoil the child" is a misquote of an even less sensible Bible verse, and either one, taken literally, is an algorithm for criminal child abuse, usually spoken by someone who's already guilty of it. While "it happened to me and I turned out okay" first assumes that you did, and then assumes that you couldn't have turned out better without it. Then there's "everything happens for a reason." Setting aside genocide, famine, tornadoes, and war, wombats have cube-shaped poop. Most of the world's koalas have chlamydia that apparently came from humans. And the common duck has the most complicated randomly branched genitalia in the animal kingdom, which in the case of the male is also explosively deployed. Please, I beg of you, either never say this to anyone expressing pain, or if you actually are a god, then bloody well explain your thinking first. Finally, if you feel like labeling anything I'm about to say as woke, please stop to consider what's so much better about remaining asleep. Basically, what I'm trying to communicate here is that human beings are full of thought-terminating cliches, from religious dogmas to political isms to the advertising copy for ludicrously overpriced Vietnamese shoes. We love to hear a pithy idea that sounds right and lets us switch off our brain and just understand the world poorly and consume. I'm going to be revealing some things you're going to need to think about. Try not to terminate that thinking early. For example, by commenting on this video before it's hit the end of its runtime. Trauma is one of those words that is so commonly used that understanding of its definition is often just assumed, even in specialist books on the subject. It literally just means wound or injury, but is usually assumed to mean a more serious wound or injury with a lasting effect. I'm specifically going to talk about psychological trauma, so wounds or injuries that affect the person's psychological state and mind, to distinguish from straightforward physical trauma to the body like cuts and burns. For better or worse, the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, otherwise known as the DSM, provides the most widely used definition of psychological trauma, at least for the purposes of diagnosing and treating it in a medical context. And the most recent version, the DSM-5-TR, or just DSM-5 for short, rather narrowly defines psychologically traumatic events as those that expose someone to harm via one of death, serious injury, or sexual violence. In any of the three, the harm can be actual or threatened, and the exposure can be direct, witnessed, or in some cases indirect. A useful introductory book on the subject is The Body Keeps the Score, which isn't exactly rigorous or scientific, but adds a lot more accessible detail and nuance to that kind of clinical definition. There, psychological trauma is both unbearable and intolerable, which is why it can be so hard to absorb and also why it's so readily transmissible. Trauma doesn't just affect the person traumatized, but can be, and very often is, passed along, both through what I'll call contact propagation, where the traumatized individual turns around and directly traumatizes others, and through what I'll call proximity propagation, where the traumatized individual's attempts to tolerate and mitigate their own harm inadvertently or indirectly causes harms to others. Beyond these types of person-to-person behavioral transmission, there's also recent evidence to suggest that psychological trauma can cause epigenetic injury to our DNA, which, if true, means it's possible that a traumatized parent can produce traumatized children, even if the traumatic event only happened to the parent. Personally, I've come to believe that none of the clinical or popular sources on the subject goes far enough in recognizing that trauma isn't necessarily bad. Philosophically, it may actually be necessary. After all, what lived human life will never involve either actual or threatened death? And if that epigenetic finding is actually true, psychological trauma may actually somehow provide some evolutionary benefit. Injuries to the body aren't inherently bad. They're just painful and stressful and something we might have to endure. Well, psychological trauma is the same. It's an injury to the thing you think of as yourself, Sometimes such an injury is minor and heals quickly, leaving no scar. Sometimes that injury is considerably more serious, leaving someone who just has to adapt to living with their new disability. In many cases, both the injury and the disability may be entirely invisible to anyone else. But in all cases, the natural response to the injury itself is to feel pain and endure stress. Both the injury and the stress are real and important medical issues, and just like when the body is injured, there's a healing process for the mind that works better when the issue is recognized promptly and treated appropriately. Unfortunately, again, just as with the body, that healing can go astray, and when the stress of a traumatic injury is significant enough, and or it isn't recognized promptly and treated appropriately, that can, and very often does, result in what is currently called post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. That term derived from what used to be called shell shock in soldiers, and from the First World War up even into the mid-2000s, it was seen as a disease exclusive to combat veterans. That was an extremely harmful example of a medical kind of confirmation bias, leading to an absurdly large number of people who had all of the signs and symptoms of PTSD going completely untreated due to generations of frontline clinicians having been trained with what was effectively another thought-terminating cliche. It has since become extremely clear that anyone can develop PTSD, and in fact that many, if not most people, will experience some degree of PTSD at some point in their lives. Arguably, if you were alive and thinking during either 9/11 or the still very much ongoing SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, there's a more than reasonable chance that you have experienced it. Realistically, you might still have the symptoms from PTSD now, even if you didn't know it by that name. The current definition in the DSM-5 is both very complex and already dated, while the 11th edition of the International Classification of Diseases, or ICD-11, is more up to date but is still very technical and clinical. So I'm going to provide a working definition that covers what you'll need for the rest of this video. If an individual experiences a traumatic event, becomes persistently impaired by it, relives their trauma, avoids reminders of the event, experiences trauma-related arousal and reactivity, feels negatively about their experiences, then they qualify for a diagnosis of PTSD. That idea of reliving trauma may seem pretty alien, but think of some experience in your life where you made a significant mistake or error and wished you hadn't. That way in which your mind and thoughts will return to it, possibly churning over and over how you could have had a different experience of that event, or over how a witty reply you only figured out too late could have saved you some scorn or embarrassment. That's reliving. But imagine it happening consistently and intrusively. Not just when you actively recall the event because someone happened to ask about it, but even when seemingly meaningless, not obviously related details unconsciously prompt your brain to head off and revisit it totally against your will. In some cases, this reliving happens only in nightmares, but in many cases, it occurs as what are called flashbacks. These are profoundly intrusive and upsetting experiences in which the traumatized individual relives and re-experiences the traumatic event while they're conscious and awake. They are caused by exposure to what are known as triggers, which are physical or emotional reminders of the event and are experienced as a rush of often vague, visceral memories, held in the body as disordered, or at least not very clearly ordered, images, sensations, feelings. It's important to contrast these visceral memories with episodic memories, which are held in the mind and to the degree we can remember the specifics, retain a generally clear sequence of events that we can navigate through with active thinking. For those who haven't knowingly experienced a flashback, it can be helpful to relate them to the usually very positive memories most people have, associating a particular smell or flavor with a favorite childhood meal or treat. We don't necessarily remember where we were, or precisely who was present, other than very vaguely, and we certainly don't remember what was written on their shirt or on something in the background. The details may not add up to anything like a movie or a photograph, but we still remember in our muscles and our senses and our bones that we were there, that we were present, and that the treat that we remember was and is real, and that it tasted good. Flashbacks are fundamentally the same. In fact, I'd argue they're exactly the same mechanism. It's just that instead of revisiting feelings of comfort and pleasure from a positive memory, Trauma-induced flashbacks involve revisiting mind-shattering horror, disgust, shame. In the first, a familiar smell triggers a rush of saliva and digestive enzymes into your mouth. In the second, it's the bitter metallic taste of adrenaline, cortisol, your stress hormones. Flashbacks can be particularly disconcerting when the trauma occurred in really early childhood, where only those visceral memories remain, and we lacked any ability to form coherent episodic memories, as the injured brain cannot compare and contrast what the muscles and the bowels remember with what the head remembers, leaving the adult sufferer with a significant and really distressing interruption in their sense of placement in time. Reliving and flashbacks are the starting point of the brain's response to psychological trauma, and that natural, acute mental process, somehow becoming a persistent, distressing, emotionally and physically painful loop, is right at the core of wrapping your mind around what PTSD fundamentally is. Again, I don't believe that trauma itself is necessarily bad or even negative, and I don't believe that either this or any part of the post-traumatic response is inherently bad or negative either. They're just kind of simple, automatic processes. Another kind of cognitive bias we inherited from other, earlier, for lack of a better word, simpler brains. Our human brains are vastly more complex and complicated than the animal brains that they've essentially developed on top of. So a mechanism that fundamentally exists to teach an animal that has just survived encountering something dangerous, something life-threatening, to either do the same thing, do a different thing, or completely avoid that dangerous thing in the future turns, in us, into a compulsive loop of reliving. That's because what our brains are actually trying to do is to recapitulate the event, but instead it gets caught reenacting the event. Both of those are forms of reliving, but you can think of reenacting as just repeating the event over and over without getting any new understanding or changing the outcome. While recapitulation is repeating the event, but each time exploring new paths, searching for new understanding, a new way of thinking about what happened. The human brain is fundamentally a learning and prediction engine. What it's trying to do is figure out what went wrong in the past and how to prepare for and get it right in the future. But human emotions, which if you think about it are really just a brute force signal to either run away from, run towards, murder, have sex with, or do all of the above to something, can get so involved that they make the learning impossible. They flood the body with inputs so strong, they overwhelm the thinking and planning of the conscious mind. The mind wants to turn its sense that it did something wrong into clear, unemotional certainty that it either couldn't have done anything else at all, or is now armed to do something right. And when and if it achieves that recapitulation, the trauma is healed and we don't need to relive it anymore at all. Complete that process and the loop is done, and we've achieved what philosophers call catharsis, which if you've ever seen the movie Groundhog Day, you'll recognize as the day you finally wake up and find out there's something new on the radio. The reliving, the flashing back is over. Life can move on. Don't complete that process, though, and you're just stuck in a cycle of reliving and reliving and reliving, and each loop brings back the same intense emotional signals and leaves you, perversely, wanting to experience it again, only somehow better, while simultaneously not wanting to experience it ever again at all. The overall goal and drive is to somehow succeed in fully recapitulating the event, to no longer need to revisit it, because every possible learning opportunity related to the event has been explored and exhausted, and the mind is satisfied, and the intense emotions of the body's defensive posture are simply no longer required. But that requires the opportunity and the freedom to experience those emotions safely. Unfortunately, our societies are not particularly good at providing safe environments for us to freely experience intense emotions, never mind opportunities to witness and interact with others who are doing so. And so people who experience PTSD very often find themselves driven by part of their own mind's learning and healing mechanisms into environments and situations that at least feel dangerous and may actually be dangerous, both for themselves and for others. Sadly, if the yearning to recapitulate is strong enough and that safe space just doesn't exist, the victim of an initial trauma can find themselves vulnerable and prone to, and very often feeling complicit in, what is termed revictimization. This is where someone, consciously or unconsciously seeking to address a past traumatic event, ends up not merely reliving that past event through flashbacks and memory, but puts themselves sufficiently in harm's way that they end up experiencing another trauma, which might echo or actually recreate the first, compounding both the damage and the disease. Even more tragic is the worst possible outcome, where instead of harming theirself through revictimization, the victim turns their irresistible impulse to recapitulate into the active harming of others, twisting their own hell of reliving into recidivism, spinning new victims off into their own hells with each, and in the worst cases, every turn of the screw. That powerful, and in some cases entirely irresistible, urge to recapitulate is, in the end, the engine that drives PTSD. Someone who's experienced a traumatic event has no conscious desire to relive that event. They wake up with the same underlying hope of just having an agreeable, productive day as anyone and everyone else. But because something wired in our brain needs to learn from something that went wrong, our body does, against our will, throw an intensely disturbing flashback into our path whenever it's either prompted to by our environment or just simply has the opportunity. As you can imagine, this reliving of trauma is intensely unpleasant, and those who experience reliving, and especially flashbacks, consistently develop an intense, compulsive need to scrupulously avoid their triggers. This pattern of avoidance behavior is a kind of flawed coping strategy that appears entirely sensible until you realize that the trigger itself is only very rarely consciously known and recognized, and may, at best, be only vaguely or tangentially associated with the original trauma. Some specific object, smell, or taste that may merely be present in the everyday, normal, otherwise safe environment can become so important to avoid that it leads to a significant phobia, obsessive bathing, or avoidance of entire food groups. And these can endure for years or even decades after the trauma itself has long passed. Attempting to avoid, by whatever means necessary, fully reliving the original trauma is fundamentally the flawed survival strategy at the core of PTSD. The means can be external, which is why those who have suffered trauma very commonly turn to alcohol, drugs, or other forms of self-medication in order to numb themselves and avoid the constant reliving. They can also be internal, and many who have suffered trauma will use obsessive and compulsive thinking, rituals, and distraction to keep themselves from feeling what otherwise threatens to overwhelm them yet again. External, internal, or both, it's an entirely understandable response to finding oneself suddenly reliving trauma. An event occurred. Our mind and our body were overwhelmed, and yet nevertheless they and we survived, otherwise the stress wouldn't be post-traumatic. And then, for lack of a better way of putting it, the mind and the body seek to protect ourselves from feeling that overwhelmed ever again in the future, not just by not putting ourselves back into the same dangerous situation, but also by not allowing us to feel everything that we felt in the past, which would probably work perfectly well if we were simply short-lived and unthinking animals that merely needed to not put themselves in an alligator's maw ever again. For better or worse, neither we humans nor our societies are such simple entities, and the complex responses and behaviors we develop after first finding ourselves in that alligator's maw can themselves cause significant and ongoing distress, both to ourselves and to others. By definition, someone who has PTSD has developed heightened arousal and reactivity to the world around them that persists well beyond the original traumatic event. You can think of this as a leftover remnant or artifact of what's commonly called the fight or flight response. Except that fight or flight is really just another example of a thought-terminating cliché, as reality almost never comes down to just those two options. And in humans, who lack claws and teeth and can't run all that fast, neither option will almost ever succeed. It would be more accurate to call it the fight, flight, fright, freeze, faint, fawn response, but that's simply too many F words, so I'll call it the acute stress response. Any animal confronted with an immediate threat of death, serious injury, or sexual violence will respond to that threat by choosing to try one of several available survival strategies. They can fight, or at least posture like they're going to. They can take flight or run away. They can take fright, jumping or screaming, or otherwise trying to startle the threat or draw attention to it. They can freeze, like a deer in the headlights. They can faint, or fall to play dead. Or they can fawn, trying to survive by cooperating or ingratiating themselves with the threat. Not all of these exist in all living things, but for any given creature on the phylogenetic tree, there's the set they've inherited, a list of short, inbuilt programs to select from and run to try and keep the body alive, quite possibly without the brain's intervention. If they're still alive after the first has been run and the threat still persists, they'll try another and another in a loop until either they're dead or the threat has gone away. In the very simplest animals, their selection order is hardwired. In the slightly more complex, it's essentially just a random choice. Animals with brains complex enough to allow for persistent memory might start with random choice, but can learn to respond to future threats based on what was most successful in the past. In the most complex animal brains, ones that incorporate emotions and conscious thinking on top of mere memory, that initial selection can be modified by a quick appraisal of the odds of success given the specific new threat, as well as past experiences of other threats. In human brains, however, our available options depend on not just our prior experience and knowledge, but also our mental model of ourselves, real and imagined, as well as our mental model of those around us. Our minds are not entirely singular. We are social beings, kind of by definition, and our judgment of the right and wrong thing to do is very much determined by what we perceive would be both the private and the public consequences of our actions, as well as what those have been in the past. As we grow and learn, we develop and refine these mental models in what is trauma, but a shocking and painful opportunity to test our existing model and learn where it's failed to match up with reality. When such a failure is recognized, it drives reliving in order to understand how to evolve the model, but the emotional intensity of that drives avoidance, and the resulting tension can cause the heightened arousal and reactivity typical of PTSD. These two can be expressed in a number of different ways, but for the purposes of this video, the main one you need to know is called hypervigilance. This is a form of severe anxiety that involves extremely heightened sensory sensitivity, constant scanning of the environment for threats, and preparation to react to those perceived threats based on what the current mental model sees as the more appropriate response. It's an overstimulation of the nervous system, leading to sweaty palms, a racing heart, intense muscle tension, and the attention rapidly darting around the environment. It can resemble a severe panic attack, but it can also lead to erratic behavior and what can seem to anyone else as exaggerated self-defensive postures, verbalizations, and behaviors. As the perceived threat may only be an artifact of the sensory overload, hypervigilance can be confused with paranoia, though it's important to understand there are no delusions or hallucinations that are present. People with persistent hypervigilance also often develop obsessive-compulsive behaviors and rituals to try and avoid crowds, triggering situations, and unsafe spaces, but also just to calm what can feel like irrationally heightened constant anxiety. As I've said, however, trauma is not necessarily bad, or at least not entirely bad for us, and hypervigilance can at times be an altered state that is experienced as both positive and enabling, ironically, often in actually dangerous situations where the extra situational awareness and attention to detail is helpful, if not even sometimes pleasant, while those without the extra supply of attentiveness find the same environment bewildering, if not terrifying and disabling. However it's experienced, hypervigilance is the most obvious and also most disrupting symptom of PTSD. It brings with it significant social impacts, sometimes extreme difficulty with self-command, leading to severe insomnia, and eventually breakdowns due to simple exhaustion. These disruptions make it the symptom that usually brings the traumatized into contact with psychiatric systems. Unfortunately, descriptions of what can be a potent mix of both negative and positive hypervigilant experiences can sound very much like the rapid cycling of bipolar disorder, the emotional instability of borderline personality disorder, or the darting attention and social miscues of autism and ADHD, too often leading to a history of misdiagnosis and inappropriate, and sometimes extremely harmful, medical interventions. Given the exhaustion brought on by prolonged hypervigilance, the inevitable failure to avoid triggers, and the painful disruption of flashing back, it's no wonder that PTSD brings with it intense negativity. Unless immediately supported and appropriately treated, it's normal to develop symptoms of severe depression, to feel socially isolated and alone, and to develop negative thoughts and beliefs about the world and the self, especially overwhelming anger, shame, humiliation, and guilt. It's relatively easy to see how a traumatic experience could manifest as a lack of trust in others, especially others that were somehow complicit in the trauma. For example, a person bitten by a dog ceases to trust that breed of dog, or possibly even dogs in general. But it's considerably harder to understand how easy, normal, even ubiquitous it is for the traumatized to develop a complete lack of trust in their own self, and sometimes a complete and total lack of trust as a concept altogether. An exaggerated, even obsessive need to assign blame for the trauma can develop. And where the villain at fault isn't known, or worse when known, but it's someone who had been very trusted or close, that blame very often ends up falling on the traumatized individual and their own actions, even when they could not have either caused or avoided the event, or could have reduced their own harm or the harm to anyone else in even the slightest way. Sadly, those ideas can easily be reinforced by the social consequences of the erratic behaviors and emotional outbursts typical of someone with untreated PTSD. These negative beliefs can in turn lead to risky, impulsive behaviors, acting out, and further re-traumatization, leading to further reinforcement. Left untreated, this spiral, just another kind of fugoid, can easily, and usually does, lead to at least one of eating disorders, self-harming, addictions, victimizing of others, suicidal impulses, and suicidal acts. Even for those fortunate enough to escape that spiral under their own power, there can still linger a pervasive, powerful sense that one's life was irrevocably altered, if not entirely voided, by the traumatic experience. A general sense of hopelessness and pointlessness can develop, and this takes hold consistently enough across those with PTSD that it's been termed a sense of foreshortened future. Someone who has physically survived the traumatic event can feel, both emotionally, but also through the constant reliving of flashbacks, viscerally and intellectually dead, as if they did not survive at all, as if their life was truncated. When they witnessed other lives being actually truncated, this can become survivor's guilt. When it was their own life they felt slipping away, it can leave them perpetually expecting someone or something to arrive to finish the job. Access to creativity, play, art, pride, or a sense of accomplishment can be left perpetually out of reach, along with loving and trusting connections and intimacy, both in relationships with others, but also in one's relationship with one's own body. Reliving, avoidance, arousal, and negativity. Those four groups of symptoms are each going to be present in anyone that receives a diagnosis of PTSD according to today's understanding. You can think of them as the basic ingredients, but just as there's the generalized idea of a cake and then there's specific kinds of cakes, there's the general notion of PTSD and then there's specialized subtypes of it. In the current version of the DSM-5, there are only 3 recognized subtypes: delayed, dissociative, and preschool. These are definitely not the only subtypes, and the ICD-11 has an entire section on how PTSD is experienced by those never even glanced at by the American Psychiatric Association. But for the purposes of this video, you'll need to know about those 3. The delayed PTSD subtype is the easiest to understand. It's the same 4 clusters of symptoms, but instead of all the symptoms developing nearly immediately or at most within 6 months of the trauma, some or all of them may take considerably longer to manifest, usually, but not always, in the range of 1 to 2 years. This subtype exists almost as a bookkeeping fix. While the DSM was never intended to be used for insurance coding, that didn't stop for-profit American insurance companies from simply denying coverage to anyone that had all the correct symptoms, but those symptoms didn't arise both immediately and all at once. Really, it should always have been obvious that there's no specific amount of time in which any given human being should either process their trauma or develop their symptoms. The ICD-11 already recognizes this, and most likely all future versions of the DSM series just won't put a time limit on the onset of symptoms. The key point is that while PTSD symptoms usually develop in relatively close association to the traumatic event itself, they don't always do so. The dissociative PTSD subtype is harder to grasp. In addition to the 4 standard clusters, some form of persistent dissociation develops, resulting in a significantly altered and distorted relationship between the mind, the emotions, and the body. This subtype is less common, and it's a lot harder to diagnose. But it's surprisingly consistent amongst those who are trapped by, compelled to participate in, or otherwise unable to act in any way to change or escape from their trauma. In a sense, those who couldn't fight and couldn't take flight and had to resort to the flopping, fawning, or freezing acute stress responses. Their dissociative experiences can arise in either or both of two forms, known as depersonalization and derealization. Depersonalization is what most people would think of as an out-of-body experience, feeling like the body is being witnessed being traumatized, whether from above or from a third party or some other altered perspective. It's essentially a shortcut by which the mind just doesn't need to directly feel what the body is feeling in order to survive. And instead it decides that this isn't happening to me, or this is happening but to someone else. That shortcut can be extremely powerful, allowing a human being to endure intense, otherwise unbearable physical agony or confinement during a traumatic experience itself. But when it persists or recurs after the event, it can leave that same being suffering with a profound sense of disconnection and detachment from even the most basic bodily pleasures of life, leaving them numb or unreactive to sensations of smell, taste, touch, even pain. That numbing can result in chronic issues with unobserved or unnoticed injuries, which can make simple everyday tasks like preparing food and cooking unaided unusually risky. When particularly stressed, acute depersonalization can lead to bouts of tunnel vision, with partial or complete loss or distortion of peripheral vision, making it difficult, if not impossible, to safely operate a vehicle or navigate road crossings. Derealization is, instead, a sense that what is happening to the body and being experienced by the mind simply isn't real. It's an alternative shortcut that allows the mind to just not feel very strongly about what is happening, since it's only happening in a dream, a nightmare, or some other form of fiction. Again, the shortcut can be very powerful, allowing the conscious mind to endure otherwise unendurable events. But instead of not feeling the pain and witnessing it from somewhere else, the pain is felt and seen to be occurring. It's just not really happening, or couldn't really have happened exactly as remembered. This form of dissociation seems to be particularly common in the kinds of mass casualty events that garner the most media attention, with shaken survivors appearing in interviews commonly using phrases like, "it was like a movie." It might also explain why so many people who have witnessed truly traumatic events, but only through videos shared uncensored over social media, are so prone to believing in false flags and grand conspiracies, rather than simply accept the terrible reality of what they've seen. As with depersonalization, this shortcut also has real-world consequences in those who regularly or acutely experience it, as they can feel like they are going mad, living in a dream, or are trapped inside or otherwise estranged from themselves. Again, everyday tasks like cooking and cleaning can be dangerous, while the sense that either the self or the surrounding world aren't even entirely real can make simply navigating an unfamiliar route or safely following a series of directions difficult, if not impossible. Persistent and recurrent derealization is also associated with the most elevated risks of self-harming and suicidal impulses and actions, even relative to others with PTSD. Both of these dissociative responses can be seen as alternative pathways to hypervigilance. They're a way of avoiding the traumatic event or just memories of it by letting someone else experience it in our place. The problem is that someone else is still fundamentally us. The preschool PTSD subtype is, without a doubt, the most tragic, as it's the result of children under the age of 6 being forced to encounter what appears to them to be death, serious injury, or sexual violence. It probably shouldn't be called preschool at all, and the cutoff at 6 years is a completely arbitrary one. There's no fundamental developmental switch that is always flipped one way immediately before that age and automatically flips the other way at some specific birthday. It's just the age that was used in studies that happened to begin inside a culture that also happens to have kids move from preschool to regular school around that age. There's also no good reason, or obvious reason, to believe that it's got anything to do with school at all. It's probably got more to do with the language acquisition and cognition and sense of self and memory formation changes that are usually developing around the age children usually begin school. So really, we should just think of this as PTSD as it occurs in the very youngest humans. It involves the standard 4 clusters of symptoms, can also involve the 2 dissociative forms, and onset of any or all of the symptoms can be delayed by years. Because children, and especially toddlers, can't reliably verbalize or otherwise communicate about their experiences or their emotional state may not have yet developed the ability to form clearly arranged episodic memories, and may simply not have enough context to recall what memories they do have or react to them in ways that an adult, armed with both more words and more context, might consider appropriate. The criteria that would usually apply to adults are relaxed and altered, especially where children would have a hard time understanding or describing ideas such as flashbacks, avoidance, hypervigilance, or a sense of a foreshortened future. The emphasis with this subtype is in getting affected children into treatment early by getting adults to better recognize what behaviors might crop up in a child affected by trauma, and to understand that significant and sudden changes in behavior, affect, or mood with no other obvious cause really must be investigated, so that a child who was previously gentle, confident, and placid, who suddenly begins to draw violent imagery, startles and withdraws, and throws extreme temper tantrums, can be treated for an experience that might otherwise remain hidden. So that is introductory level PTSD in the proverbial nutshell. It's a psychological wound that hasn't yet healed, caused by an experience that you relive, but that you want to avoid reliving, which drives hypervigilance and or disassociation to keep you avoiding, all of which feels really, really bad. It's the body's longer-term response when the damage caused by its short-term acute stress response to some kind of very serious threat wasn't properly managed or repaired. In that way, it's not all that different to an autoimmune response, which might be a fever that passes, and it usually is, but it can also be decades of debilitating arthritis or even the cytokine storm that kills us before a new virus even has a chance to make us sick on its own. Again, trauma isn't necessarily bad. And just like muscle and bones that hurt after lifting a lot of weight or running really hard can heal back to make our bodies considerably stronger, trauma, well managed, can do the same for our minds and our emotions. That's how we grow and eventually discover our depth and capacity for resilience. The problem isn't the trauma. The problem is when that trauma isn't well managed, and either our own internal support systems or those we lean on for help outside of us don't cope with it, that lasting damage can occur. Unfortunately, our animal minds seem to have wired in both the reliving and the avoidance programs. Our internal support systems just aren't inherently strong, and external support systems for mental health can barely be said to even exist. Something literally hardwired by our biology into all of us makes PTSD the normal pathway we'll all go down if we experience trauma individually, haven't been prepared for it, and don't communally respond to it. If you experience something unbearable and intolerable, and you don't somehow just bear it and tolerate it, and who could, then you'll have to ask for the help of others. And the sad fact is that right now, it's extremely unlikely that meaningful help will actually be there. There's good, initial, early days evidence that if that help did arrive and someone with basic empathy simply handed you a copy of Tetris to play within a couple of hours of the event and before you would next go to sleep, you'd have a much better chance of not developing the worst of PTSD. Why? Excellent question. No one knows, but we should really be researching and finding out. Because without simple interventions like Tetris, or someone trained to talk to and provide a caring shoulder to cry on, really cry on, then trauma can become something that does unbearable and intolerable damage to ourselves, to our families, and to our societies. That's where I have to introduce what are, hopefully, the final acronyms. If post-traumatic stress disorder is what happens when trauma isn't properly addressed, then complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD, is what happens when PTSD isn't properly addressed. It's quite a new term, so new it hasn't made it into the DSM-5 at all, but is in the ICD-11, and over the last 5 years has become quite widely recognized and used. A related term, which we'll come across if you read The Body Keeps the Score, is developmental trauma disorder, or DTD. This was proposed for the DSM-5, but didn't make it in, while the ICD-11 tries to address most, but not all, of the points in that book by adding a large series of childhood developmental specific notes to the definition for CPTSD. For the purposes of this video, you can kind of think of DTD as CPTSD when it develops specifically in children, but if you're interested in reading more, there's good reason to think of them as distinct disorders, especially when the person being treated is still currently a child. By whichever name it's given, CPTSD develops after prolonged, repetitive exposure to traumatic events, especially where that exposure is difficult or impossible to escape, and is common amongst those who have experienced war, starvation, torture, slavery and human trafficking, campaigns of genocide or ethnic cleansing, solitary confinement, domestic violence, and childhood exploitation, neglect, and abuse. All of the 4 core symptom clusters of PTSD develop, and quite often depersonalization and derealization develop too to some degree. Because of the repetitive exposure to unaddressed, untreated trauma, these responses across multiple traumatic events link together in a deeply interconnected and complex fashion. As a result, someone with CPTSD displays 3 more symptom groups. They have severe and persistent difficulty with regulating their emotions. They hold persistent, extremely negative beliefs and feelings about themselves. And they have substantial difficulty sustaining relationships with and feeling close to others. These 3, in turn, lead to significant and very protracted, often lifelong impairment in many of the most important and vital parts of what it means to be human. Those with CPTSD often have very weak family and social connections, leading to suffering of intense loneliness and isolation throughout their lives. They also tend to face substantial difficulty with both education and work opportunities, leading to chronic underemployment for most, while those who do work can find themselves unusually high functioning, but simply unable to take any satisfaction or pride in any of their achievements. The sense of a foreshortened future that can develop in PTSD sufferers very often infects those who go on to develop CPTSD with a pervasive, ever-present worldview of truncation. The sense that their life ended at some point in the trauma can compound with a sense of profound shame and embarrassment at having physically survived at all, leaving them both robbed of any capacity to feel their life has any purpose, value, or meaning, and also fixated on somehow making amends for having endured what they endured at the hands of others. It's critical to understand and accept that CPTSD is an extremely serious mental illness, one that develops through no fault or failure of the person it develops within. The fact that it's the label given to the symptoms that consistently develop amongst those who've endured the very worst events in human history, the sort of things international law labels as war crimes and crimes against humanity, should really hammer that home, full stop, mic drop. But somehow it doesn't. That's because most of us don't get to experience torture, genocide, or ethnic cleansing in a lifetime. Those sort of things happen over there to other people, and it's always hard for we to develop much empathy for them, except immediately after we're confronted with the ovens and the piles of hair and teeth. It's also easy enough for us to convince ourselves that they've brought the horror down on themselves somehow by just trying to go about their days and make bread and feed their children, while someone they didn't necessarily vote for and don't necessarily support did something we don't like. And even if we are the sort of person that's woken up from that dream long enough to recognize that an unbearable horror having passed doesn't mean that its causes and effects have passed, that doesn't mean we're not the sort of person to get so distracted by the relatively rare terrors that we fail to think of or address the common and mundane ones. A lot of people can understand that war, torture, genocide, slavery, these would have huge effects on my mental health, so they'd have huge effects on someone else's, and they accept that. But they still fail to see a criminal confined in a cell alone as equivalent. And they don't see a mother who refuses to leave that partner who, when he's home, slaps her whenever his team loses is quite as bad, or the children she turns around and spanks when she's weak and tired enough. The thing to recognize with CPTSD is that the vast majority of those who suffer with it weren't exposed to the very worst events in human history. They didn't come face to face with unmitigated evil, whatever that is. No, they suffered a very long list of what were often, individually, very small wounds, but wounds that never got treated and that accumulated. They suffered the mundane, ubiquitous kinds of evil, weren't empowered to escape it, hadn't been prepared with the emotional skills and knowledge required to navigate the damage done, and then were left to deal with the aftermath. If they didn't happen to have been born either rich or into a country with a truly world-class universal healthcare system, then the odds are they found it much easier to treat their wounds with alcohol, drugs, or bad relationships than they did to find the help of an empathetic doctor or a trained therapist, much less a competent psychiatrist specialized in treating CPTSD. If they weren't the exceptionally lucky few who did find such a support, then what are the odds they didn't carry their trauma forward by either contact or proximity to those around them, and especially their children? It's not hard to see that poor medicines don't usually lead to good outcomes. Well, poor relationships don't usually lead to good parents, but they very often lead to children with poor parents. That's what allows CPTSD to readily do what PTSD alone does not usually accomplish. It propagates itself through families and generations. Unnoticed, unrecognized, or untreated, it either kills or it spreads, and then it keeps on spreading. People who have CPTSD and aren't able to get it treated have an extremely good chance of inflicting CPTSD on others, very often children, especially their own. This is usually via exposure to their poorly managed emotional controls, often through their warped view of themselves or their weak relationships, but it can also be their thwarted urge to recapitulate, leaving children watching adults re-victimize themselves, or worse, directly suffering abuse at those adults' recidivist hands. Again, this is just yet another alternative pathway, another automatic program that the body can and will follow. And when a human being can't control their emotions, has extremely negative views of themselves, and has difficulty forming and maintaining close, trusting relationships, they simply don't get a chance to develop the skills required to be safe and effective parents. We'll combine that with another program that the body just tends to follow without a lot of thought, and suddenly 9 months later, you've got a child exposed to a parent with all those issues and none of those skills. It's a consistent pattern of behavior that started as a faulty survival mechanism, again, pretty much wired into our brains, and now it's primed and ready to pass to, and then through, children, precisely because children really lack the toolkit to be able to self-assemble the way to respond to the unpredictability of their wounded parent. So when they're scared and wounded by that parent, what can they possibly do but fall back on their acute stress response? On and on, the juggernaut's wheels turn, and it crushes generations beneath it. There has likely never been a single death certificate that lists the cause of death as CPTSD. Instead, there are literally uncountable number of death certificates that list opioid abuse, kidney failure, cirrhosis of the liver, lung cancer, adult onset diabetes, heart disease, chronic obesity, suicide, homicide. Were all of those lives lost to CPTSD? No, but a very significant number of them were, and often the initiating traumatic event was multiple generations ago, and then it just cascaded, untreated, down, picking up energy and speed as it fell. As I said, it's a very new term, but it's a very old disease. Most of us have been touched by it, even if just very lightly. And most of us know of at least one person that's been devastated by it, even if we don't know who they are. CPTSD is what happens when PTSD isn't properly addressed and treated. It's what happens when a wound that could have healed first festers, then rots, and then the tissue starts to die. Once the rot sets in, the price is going to be much, much higher than ever needed to be paid. If it spreads far enough, the price is literally incalculable. Now you've got the vocabulary you need. Trauma is a wound. PTSD is an untreated and infected wound, and CPTSD is a series of wounds beset by a gangrene that's both infectious and resistant to drugs. All three are serious medical issues that need a serious, coordinated, socialized response, and all three can be just as fatal as physical wounds. In fact, trauma very often is fatal. We just don't stop to think about those who didn't survive the immediate physical health concerns caused by exposure to death, serious injury, or sexual violence, as those who simply didn't survive long enough to develop the associated mental health concerns. I really can't stress this point strongly enough. These three levels of psychological injury aren't just analogous to physical injuries, they're exactly the same and should be treated exactly the same. Literally no one, and especially no child, is expected to self-treat anything but the very most minor of physical injuries. And then as the seriousness of the injury increases, we've got layers upon layers of response. From the family first aid kit to whole systems of doctors' offices and hospitals and ambulances and medevac helicopters, all the way up to blue water navies with hospital ships. These days, in any developed country, There's what's known as defense in depth. All these enormous systems, trained and equipped and ready and waiting to treat progressively more serious physical injuries. And yet virtually none of that resourcing exists for psychological injuries. The human brain is, by an incredible margin, the single most important organ to any human life. But you tell me where the psychological first aid kit is in your home, or precisely what to do, or who to call for advice in the moments after a psychological injury has occurred. Here in England, you often see a taxpayer-purchased defibrillator box in public spaces, housing an expensive piece of equipment that has a quite small chance of helping less than 1 in 5 people who happen to suffer a pretty specific kind of heart attack very nearby to one. Where's the portable copies of Tetris to hand out to all those who just witnessed its most likely unsuccessful use? They're not there, but they very likely would prevent much more suffering at a tiny fraction of the cost. Just 2 weeks ago, I was first on scene at a fatal tram accident. I and at least 50 others saw a beautiful 3-year-old child destroyed by several thousand pounds of uncontrolled metal and plastic. Dozens of police officers and other first responders arrived within minutes. Hundreds of hours of their time were spent attending to and caring for and cleaning up after what was, ultimately, already a dead body before any of them arrived. No one asked if I was okay. No one has offered help, except to signpost me to services that signpost me on to further signposts, around and around in meaningless circles. Thanks to my secret, I'm already pretty equipped to deal with it, but the others likely aren't. The 10-year-old girl with the glasses, whose mom accidentally pulled her past something she will never unsee, certainly wasn't equipped to deal with it. Why didn't I have a copy of Tetris for her already at hand? Why wasn't there someone there with a copy for me? They weren't there precisely because we, as a species, tend to think of injuries to the parts of our body that house our mind as a public problem, but injuries to the mind that body houses as a private one. And that, quite frankly, is because we're all engaged in post-traumatic avoidance. And that finally has us all on common ground. I'm sorry it's taken this long and this many words, but there truly are some secrets that can't be spoken aloud without context, and this has been me preparing the way. Now, though many of the people watching this think they know me, and a small number of them actually have some cause to believe they do, the reality is that no one knows me. Not really. Right at the start of this video, I introduced myself, but that was just the very surface. To dig down to the marrow to find anything meaningful, I'm going to have to take you deeper to keep reintroducing myself. We finally cleared away the dust and the detritus and the furniture. We're on the same ground. The drill is ready and it's time to dig. This is the point at which I can finally, really, just start to properly introduce myself. Thank you for listening to Finding Common Ground, the second episode of this 8-part series. My story continues in episode 3, My First Education, available now.